Hello everyone. This is another video to try and help you with some problem solving strategies. This one in particular is for a multi-part problem where an object is doing one thing in one part and another thing in another part. Right now we're only studying constant velocity, so we can only change speed, but later they will get more complicated, like speed up, slow down, skid, collide, become a projectile, like 5-part problems. But for now, we're developing some strategies. So clearly this car is doing one speed for a certain amount of time and then another speed for a certain amount of distance. All right, but it is 2 parts because there's a change in motion. You could also call these multi-motion problems. So the way to handle this is to get organized and list your variables for each part. I'm going to call this one part 1 because I'm super creative with names. But if you have a better name, you use it. So I'm going to do the velocity for part 1, delta D for part 1, and delta T for part 1. Part 2, maybe you'll call this travel twice the speed. I don't know, maybe you'll get creative. I'm just calling it part 2. Velocity for part 2, distance traveled for part 2, and time for part 2. Okay. The other thing here that most people forget is that we can also say that the distance traveled for part 1 plus the distance traveled for part 2 is the total distance. While this seems obvious, sometimes writing it out is super useful, and it comes in pretty handy actually. Also, if you wanted, we could write that the time in part 1 plus the time in part 2 is the total time of this scenario. Again, it might seem obvious, and this problem happens to be very straightforward. But if problems become more complicated, depending on what you're given as your initial conditions and the variables provided, you may forget about these 2 expressions right here, and they're the key to solving the problem. So, may I suggest writing it out? All right, let's fill in what we know. Car 1 is doing 20 meters per second for 5 minutes. You can convert that to seconds, which is 300 seconds. Yes, convert to seconds. Part 2. This video will not be edited. Is traveling, the car travels at twice speed, at 40 meters per second, for a distance of 2 kilometers or 2,000 meters. And these problems are early on in the year, and clearly we have one expression and we have 2 knowns and 1 unknown. I mean, obviously, you're trying to figure out the unknown. So for part 1, we can figure out the distance traveled in part 1. Distance is velocity times time. So the distance for part 1 is 20 meters per second for 300 seconds, and we get 6,000 meters. For part 2, we can clearly figure out the time it took to go this 2,000 meters. So that's distance over velocity, which is 2,000 meters all over 14 meters per second, or roughly 50 seconds. Yay. All right. We basically figured out anything we could, but it does say what is the total distance and what is the total time. So total distance, total time, pretty straightforward here. We're just going to be adding these together. I'm going to write it out one more time. You don't necessarily need to do this, but I'm reminding you that this expression can be really helpful because sometimes the problem will give you the total distance and you're like, well, what do I do with that? Well, if you know one of the other distances and you know the total distance, you could figure out the distance for part 2. So this is something you could probably do in your head. 6,000 meters plus 2,000 meters. It's a terrible looking plus sign. Is 8,000 meters. Yay. And total time, again, do you need to write it out like this? No. But I'm kind of being neat. Not necessarily my handwriting, more like organized. And we have 300 seconds plus 50 seconds, or a total of 350 seconds. And that's basically it for a multi-part problem when it comes to constant velocity. There's not much more we can do until later in the year when they become like 5-part problems. All right, as a summary, all I can say, no, I don't want to switch to tablet mode. Thank you. All I can say is list your variables for each part. Okay, get organized. Don't be a number hunter. Like, you know it's a two-part problem. List your variables for each part. Then go back and fill in what you know. And the other thing I have here in blue and green is that it is actually worth writing out that the total distance is the sum of the distances and the total time is the sum of the times from each part. Again, this problem was really straightforward. And the problems that you'll probably see on an assessment are more likely to give you like a total distance or a total time, and then you got to solve for one of the other distances and time, something like that. But if you're organized, this will not be an issue. So I hope this video helped in some way, shape, or form. Again, I would give this 3 out of 5 stars, and I would not change a thing.